At the height of his power, Sultan Suleiman was feared across continents. He commanded the greatest empire on earth, with armies that never lost, and a court that bent to his every word. But then, one woman died, and the Sultan, the man known as the Magnificent, began to fade. He stopped writing his poems. He stopped leading his armies. He stopped being magnificent. His enemies didn't kill him. Grief did. This is not a love story. It's a story of obsession, of power, of silence so deafening it could bring down an emperor. Because when Hurrem Sultan, his one true love, took her final breath, Suleiman didn't just lose a wife. He lost the only part of himself that wasn't made of stone. What followed wasn't just mourning. It was a transformation, one that would change the Ottoman Empire forever. So the real question isn't just how she died. It's what her death did to the most powerful man in the world. And once you hear the ending, you'll never look at empires or love the same way again. Before the tragedy, before the silence, there was a fire that burned where it never should have. Because in the world of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan did not love. He ruled. Women in the imperial harem were never meant to be wives. They were concubines, shadows, beautiful, trained, and disposable. Their purpose? To give the Sultan sons. Nothing more. But then she came. Hurrem, a slave girl from Ruthenia, stolen from her homeland, sold into the empire's most secretive walls. No name, no title, no future. And yet she smiled. Unlike the others, she laughed in the Sultan's presence. She challenged his thoughts. She debated poetry. She dared to become human, in a place where women were treated like whispers in the dark. And something inside Suleiman, something long buried, came alive. What began as a passing fascination turned into an obsession. He stopped visiting other concubines. He gave her gifts, wrote her poems under the pen name Mahibi, the lover. He wasn't just smitten. He was enslaved by her love. And then he did the unthinkable. He freed her. He married her. For the first time in Ottoman history, a sultan made a former slave girl his legal wife. Hurrem went from concubine to queen, Sultan Zasiki, a title never used before. The palace was outraged. The harem seethed. The world watched, waiting for her to fall. But she didn't fall. She rose. Hurrem didn't just wear the crown. She rewrote the rules. She advised Suleiman on state matters. She built mosques, negotiated with foreign ambassadors, and outmaneuvered her rivals with terrifying precision. Mahidevran, the Sultan's former favorite and mother of his eldest son, was pushed aside. Even the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's childhood friend, would eventually fall from grace. Why? Because no one could come between Hurrem and the Sultan, and no one could come between Hurrem and power. But here's the part history almost never tells you. Suleiman wasn't using her. He needed her. In a world filled with war, betrayal, and politics, Hurrem was his one constant, his anchor, his mind, his mirror. She didn't just share his bed. She shared his burden. Together, they ruled an empire. Together, they built a dynasty. But empires don't last. And neither does time. For nearly 30 years, she stood by his side, not as an ornament, but as a force. And when she finally began to fall ill, Suleiman's heart, so used to surviving bloodshed and betrayal, could not prepare for this. This love was never meant to exist. It broke every rule. And when it ended, it broke the man who made the rules. They called her manipulative, dangerous, a woman who smiled too little and knew too much. But Hurrem Sultan didn't need a shout to be heard. She moved through the palace like a tide, silent, inevitable, reshaping everything in her path. Behind her beauty was a mind as sharp as the Ottoman sword. She was no longer just Suleiman's beloved. She had become his partner, his strategist, his mirror in politics. And for the empire, that changed everything. She was not meant to speak, yet she spoke for the empire. In an empire ruled by men, Hurrem became the first woman in Ottoman history to correspond directly with foreign leaders, kings, emperors, popes. She sent letters to King Sigismund of Poland, urging peace. She wrote to the Shah of Persia, to European nobles, to ambassadors whose hands trembled as they delivered her messages back home. She used language as a weapon, soft, polite, but full of warning. Inside the empire, Her influence only grew stronger. Suleiman didn't just listen to her. He deferred to her. And she knew it. The queen maker. It wasn't enough for Hurrem to hold power. She had to secure it. For her children, for her bloodline. There was one problem. Prince Mustafa, the Sultan's eldest son, born of another woman, Mahidevran, beloved by the army, popular with the people, and to Hurrem a threat. She couldn't allow him to rise, because if Mustafa became Sultan, her sons would die, and she would be erased from history. So the most dangerous game began. Whispers, accusations, letters, allegiances shifted in the shadows. It's still debated whether Hurrem truly orchestrated Mustafa's downfall, but one thing is certain. In 1553, Suleiman ordered the execution of his own son. The empire wept. The court trembled. And yet, Hurrem remained untouched. Her son, Selim, would become heir. Her legacy secured. But at what cost? Some say the execution broke something in Suleiman, that a part of him never returned from the tent where Mustafa was strangled. Others say he did it with cold precision, guided by Hurrem's logic. Either way, it wasn't just politics. It was survival. And in that world, survival meant sacrifice. The price of power. By the mid-1550s, Hurrem had achieved the impossible. She had transformed the role of women in the empire. She built mosques, hospitals, and schools. She reshaped court politics. And she laid the foundation for what would later be called the Sultanate of Women. A century of female influence at the heart of the empire. But empires are unkind to those who change them. In 1558, after decades of storms, something inside Hurrem began to collapse. Chronic illness gripped her body. Pain consumed her nights. Even the palace walls seemed to mourn. The woman who had once commanded emperors could barely rise from her bed. Suleiman visited her often. He wrote her final poems. The empire slowed around her. For once, battles waited. And then, quietly she was gone. The void. It wasn't just a death. It was an absence, a vacuum in the center of power. When Hurrem died, there was no one left who could challenge Suleiman's thoughts, who could question him, ground him, soften him. She had been the storm, but she had also. Without her, Suleiman withdrew. He no longer rode with his armies. He no longer wrote with the same fire. He no longer trusted. The palace, once alive with her whispers, grew silent. The empire, once ruled by a pair, now leaned heavily on a man already bending under the weight of memory. Suleiman still ruled for 8 more years. But ask anyone who lived then, and they will tell you. The Sultan had died long before he was buried. What remained was a shell. He had lost friends. He had buried sons. He had spilled oceans of blood to keep an empire alive. But nothing prepared Sultan Suleiman for the silence left behind by her. When Hurrem died in 1558, Suleiman was 64 years old. He had ruled for nearly 4 decades, conquered cities, rewritten laws, and reshaped the known world. But as he stood over her grave in the courtyard of the Suleimani Mosque, his most magnificent creation, he wasn't a sultan anymore. He was just a man, a husband, alone, the poet who stopped writing. For years, Suleiman had poured his love into poems. Under the pen name Mahibi, he wrote hundreds of verses to Hurrem, lines filled with longing, passion, sorrow, and devotion. But after her death, something shifted. The poetry stopped. His words, once fire and silk, faded into silence. The same silence that now echoed in the palace halls, where her laughter once danced. Those who saw him said he aged faster. His steps slowed. His eyes, once sharp as blades, turned distant, as if searching for something he could no longer reach. He no longer led campaigns from the front. He no longer smiled. The man who once ruled with iron now wandered through memories. The world moved on, but he couldn't. Even as the empire pushed forward, with wars to win and lands to govern, Suleiman seemed suspended in time. He delegated more power to others. He withdrew from court gatherings. He stayed closer to Istanbul, closer to the place where she rested. In his private chambers, they said he kept her belongings untouched. Her scent lingered in the air. Her jewelry lay undisturbed. Her letters, folded and read again and again, as if rereading them might bring her back. He wore her memory like armor, or perhaps a wound. The final march. In 1566, 8 years after Hurrem's death, Suleiman set out on his final campaign. Some say he did it out of duty. Others believe he was trying to outrun the silence that had haunted him since she died. The Sultan was old, frail, ill, but he marched anyway. He never returned. On the battlefield of Sijidvar, far from his empire's heart, Suleiman the Magnificent, conqueror of lands, lover of one, took his final breath. His death was kept secret for days, so the army would not lose morale. But back in Istanbul, preparations had already been made, because he had ordered something long ago. A tomb, built not just for himself, but beside hers. An empire etched in grief. Today, the Suleimani Mosque still stands tall over Istanbul. And there, in 2 stone tombs that face one another, lie the Sultan and the woman who changed him. History remembers him as a lawgiver, a warrior, a king of kings. But his heart was buried with her. He built an empire for millions. But for one woman, he built eternity. Centuries have passed. Empires have risen and fallen. New rulers, new wars, new stories. And yet, the names Hurrem and Suleiman still echo through time like a whispered secret. Why? Because what they left behind wasn't just marble, gold, or conquest. They left behind a legacy born of love, carved from scandal, and built on power that defied the world. She changed the rules. Before Hurrem, the women of the Ottoman harem were silent, hidden, disposable. But she changed everything. She became the first legal wife of a reigning Ottoman sultan. She bore him 5 children, unheard of at the time. She broke traditions, so ancient they were treated like law. And she walked not 3 steps behind her sultan, but beside him. In doing so, she opened the door for generations of women to wield real power. Her descendants, her daughters-in-law, her granddaughters, would go on to rule from behind the curtain for nearly 100 years. Historians would later call it the Sultanate of Women. But it began with her, a slave girl, a foreigner, a nobody who rewrote the fate of the empire. He built more than an empire. Suleiman's legacy, too, was transformed by her. Yes, he was a warrior. Yes, he was a reformer. But when we remember him today, we remember the poet, the man who loved with equal passion as he ruled. He changed the Ottoman legal code. He expanded the empire's borders farther than any sultan before or after him. But more than that, he redefined what it meant to rule with heart. With Hurrem beside him, he became something greater than a conqueror. He became human. Together, they left behind palaces, mosques, endowments, schools, foundations not just of stone, but of legacy. The Suleimani Mosque, perhaps the grandest symbol of Ottoman power, bears their tombs, side by side, not just as rulers, but as soulmates. Their children, their empire, their son, Selim too, would inherit the throne. Though not as powerful as his father, Selim's reign was marked by relative peace, something only possible because of the ruthless foundation Hurrem had secured. Their daughters were married into powerful families, extending Ottoman influence across Europe and Asia. Hurrem had ensured that every child she bore was part of a larger plan, a chessboard where she controlled every piece. And even long after her death, her presence lingered. Every woman who rose in the imperial court, every daughter who dared to speak, every queen mother who advised a sultan, they all walked through the door Hurrem had broken open, the story that refuses to die. What makes their story unforgettable isn't just its politics, or its tragedy, or even its romance. It's the impossibility of it. A sultan, worshipped like a god, fell in love with a slave. And instead of hiding her, he crowned her. Together, they turned the most rigid empire on earth into a stage for passion, poetry, and power. And that's why, even now, centuries later, their names still burn, not just in history books, but in poems, in paintings, in television shows, in the hearts of every person who ever believed love could rewrite fate. In the cold language of history, Hurrem Sultan was a concubine, then a wife, then a queen. But in the hearts of those who remember her, she became something far greater. She became immortal, not through bloodline alone, not through the tomb of stone that bears her name, but through the storm she unleashed and the silence that followed. Hurrem shattered a system built to erase women. She did not wait to be remembered. She forced history to write her in. And it did. Centuries later, historians still argue about her. Was she a schemer? A savior? A poisoner? A queen? But the very fact they ask means she won, because she refused to be invisible. While other concubines were buried nameless in unmarked graves, Hurrem lies beside a sultan, in a domed mausoleum built for eternity. While others were forgotten, her story was reborn, in books, in opera, in television, in the voices of women who saw themselves in her fight. She was not perfect, but she was unforgettable. And perhaps that is the real victory. When Suleiman died, the empire mourned, but the world did not lose one ruler that day. It lost a legend, the second half of a love that changed the shape of power. Because in the end, every empire falls. But stories like hers never do.